Okay, so there's Caitlin. You guys are like the regulars who always comes. Okay, so let's see. Let me share my screen here. And we will get started. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, I have this short presentation today for you all. But before I started, a couple students have emailed me asking questions about the exam, and I realized if we were still in class in real life, I would have already started telling you, just reminding people of the date and time of the exam. So I'm making this announcement now, but I'll also send out an email to all the students, since not everyone's here, and I'm not sure everybody watches these videos. Although your class is pretty good, in case you're curious. On Moodle, I can see who's watched the videos, and we have like about an 85% rate of people watching the videos and doing the assessment, so that's great. But for the other 15%, I have to reach them another way. So I'm just writing that down. Okay, so the final exam is Tuesday, May 19th. That's the time that the university gave us based on our class schedule. So if we were there in person, we'd be taking our exam from 10:15 to 12:15 on Tuesday, May 19th. Now, because we're in Moodle world, I'm going to do it the same way I did the midterm. So it's timed and it'll be 2 hours, but you have 24 hours just starting at that point. So starting 10:15 on Tuesday, May 19th, you can check out the exam at any time, and you have 2 hours to do it. So I think that's a pretty flexible schedule that seems to work for most people. So we will just use that again this time. And then, so the exam guide will be posted next week. This is like our last week of content for this class. And then the last week I save for in person, usually like a couple wrap-up activities, but we'll be doing exam review, like the live session, optional exam review sessions next week, and then one wrap-up class day. So do you all have any questions about that? Be clear? Okay. And I think that schedule worked well for people last time, just having the 24 hours. Okay, so thank you to the couple students. One of them was Jen, who reminded me that I need to get this announcement out to people. Okay, so today, and these notes are posted on Moodle as always, so you can like look back at this slide and I'll send out the email. Okay, so today I'm just going to introduce you to the workshop as always, and then I have a second video on Moodle that's about the Solomon Islands, which is like our case study for today. And it's a 14-minute video. You don't have to watch it to do this workshop. You can just read the workshop introduction. But at least for me, I find that like being able to picture the place and the issues in my mind just makes it more tangible to me. So the video will certainly help you, but you don't have to watch it. I know everybody's really busy with schoolwork at this time. So if you just, for people who aren't here and who are watching this video, if you just watch this video that we're recording right now and read the document, you can do the workshop without looking at that video. But at least turn it on and watch it for like a minute so you can kind of see what it looks like there. It's always fun. That video actually does a really excellent job of explaining the links between the culture in the Solomon Islands and conservation and how they interact and how they can support each other. So I encourage you to watch it. Okay, so like we were talking about on Monday I kind of focused on this idea. So, okay, what's the role of people in conservation? Well, it's something that I'm trained as a biologist, as an ecologist, right? And I didn't really get into interdisciplinary work until I started my PhD. But I drank the Kool-Aid. Like, I'm fully into interdisciplinary work. I think it's really important because you can't look at these systems in isolation. Like, you can't just look at ecosystems in isolation from human activities, because it's just not the world we live in anymore. So historically, these fields have been studied as, you know, ecology, and then sociology, and then, you know, law and business over here. But we actually need to look at them as all tied together, right? Which doesn't mean that you can't be a biologist that just specializes in cave spiders or whatever, if that's your dream. We need people studying those basic elements of biology. But believe me, when you write grants, you're going to have to write, like, what's the impact on society of the cave spiders? There's no way out of that anymore. So that's the direction we're moving in the conservation movement, is to integrate people. And so basically what the idea of biocultural diversity would argue is that, like, okay, well, maybe we're coming to this idea right now of integrating people into conservation, but that's kind of just a social construct, because they're already integrated into natural systems, right? We are already integrated into natural systems. So biocultural diversity is like the term of the day, biocultural diversity. And it has this, oh my God, the cat is literally like pushing the mouse. Excuse me while I throw him out of the room. Not throw. Put him out of the room. Yeah. Okay, there we go. So biocultural diversity is the term we're going to be talking about today, and that's the total variety exhibited by the world's natural and cultural systems. Now, when you all are looking at the slides here, are your heads blocking the systems word, or can you see them? Okay. So when I move my block with the heads, it doesn't move yours. All right, well, it's fine. Okay. So what is the intersection between cultural and biological diversity? Well, it's actually there's a really high correlation between those two things. There's been a lot of work in like the last 15 or 20 years looking at, okay, well, where are the world's biodiversity hotspots? We've covered that at length in the past couple weeks. And then where are the world's cultural diversity hotspots? And so this map is showing each one of those red dots is a culture, and I'll explain that more in a second. And then the red, like the red color that's kind of softer on the edges, those are biodiversity hotspots. So you can see that there's like a huge overlap between dense cultural areas and dense biodiversity areas, right? It's not a perfect overlap, but there's a lot of intersection of those two. Now, how can a culture be represented as a dot? Well, those are languages. So language is often used as a proxy to represent a separate culture, because if you think about like the social isolation you need to develop a totally separate language, it's often comes along with like developing totally different beliefs and practices and social systems. So social scientists use language as a proxy for culture. So that's what those dots are. So in places where there's tons of different languages or cultures, there's also tons and tons of different species. So let me just say one more thing about that. That's not saying that like biodiversity causes languages to develop, nor the other way around, right? They correlate probably because like the areas that they're in are really resource rich, and so more niches creates more biodiversity, and then more resources creates like more human groups living in proximity to each other. So actually, I guess the biological diversity does kind of cause the cultural diversity over time, but not the other way around. Okay, so let's look at the Solomon Islands. So if you are feeling like spring can't get here fast enough and you just want to get to a beach somewhere, well, good luck, because you probably won't because of the pandemic. But I did pick this nice beach-centered site for you today because I personally am missing the summer. So we're going to travel to the Solomon Islands, which have some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. I've never been there, but I did study abroad in Australia when I was a student. So I've been to the region. Now, here's where this region is. Here's Australia. And the Solomon Islands are right here, right by Papua New Guinea. So right to the east of Papua New Guinea, but they're their own country. And Papua New Guinea, for anyone here who has some biology background, is known as like a major biodiversity hotspot on the planet. It's one of the only places where new vertebrate species are still discovered every couple of years. So if you want to be, one of your dreams is to discover a new species and name it after you, this is like one of the top spots in the world to go to do that. And this quote is from Jared Diamond from 1976. Jared Diamond, if you haven't heard of him, is a famous biologist and also social scientist. He's a real polyglot, but he wrote those books like Collapse and Guns, Germs, and Steel, if you've heard of those. And so he did a lot of his PhD work studying species distributions in this region of the world. And he said there's no other species in the world, not even the Galapagos Islands, where speciation and population variation between the islands is so marked as in the Solomon Islands. Now, why is that? Well, they're in the tropics and they're islands. And so they basically, each one of these islands is separate enough that it can be genetically isolated from other islands, and also has a wide range of ecosystems, because there's also like high altitude and low altitude ecosystems on those islands. So incredible biodiversity. Here's just a quick look at some of the biodiversity. There's 20 endemic bird species, including this little one, the rainbow lorikeet. There's 17 endemic bat species, really important, of course. And so most of the native mammals on the islands are bats and giant rats, which sounds terrible, but not, since you know bats are so amazing. But these rats down here, like this is a rat species that was recently discovered about 10 years ago, and they get up to a foot in length, which, you know, supposedly like rats in the city sewers do too, but not really. I'm talking about without their tail, like their body's up to a foot. And they live in the trees and they eat nuts. So rats and bats and many, many, many amazing, beautiful birds. It's also home to the largest skink in the world, which is more than 2 feet long. Pretty cool fact if you're into reptiles, or not reptiles, herps in general. Okay, so there's incredible marine biodiversity as well. They have tons and tons of reefs surrounding all of those islands, and they're in this area called the Coral Triangle, which you'll see in your workshop write-up. And it has the second highest level of coral diversity in the world. And there's also a ton of species of commercial value there. So that fish that I pasted in there down there, that's a tuna. There's about 6 different species of tuna that live in the Solomon Islands that are commercially valuable. So very, very, very commercially valuable fisheries and beautiful coral reefs. Okay, so that's just a quick one on biological diversity. We could just look at pictures of species from there all day, but we don't have time. So cultural diversity in the Solomon Islands. What about cultural diversity? Well, first we have to define culture, right? And here's one definition of culture: the system of shared symbols, beliefs, behaviors, values, norms, artifacts, and institutions that the members of a society use to cope with their world and with one another, and that are transmitted from generation to generation through learning. That's culture. It's also interesting to think of it in the sense of, do animals have culture? To think of that definition. But today we're thinking about people. So that is cultural. That's one reasonable working definition of culture. So what is the cultural diversity like on the Solomon Islands? Well, it's a tiny place, right? You can see that on the map, but there's also incredible cultural diversity there. So if we use language as a proxy for cultural diversity, like I mentioned before, there's between 70 and 85 languages are actively spoken in the Solomon Islands. So that's incredible, right? Not 70 to 85 that ever existed, but that are currently actively spoken. So raise your hand if you speak more than one language. Raise your hand if you speak more than two. Is anyone raising their hand? I can't see. Does anyone speak more than two? No. Okay, so this is very common in the US, right? We speak one, most of us speak one language or sometimes two. And then there's all these, like, to me, pretty wild debates over like, English is our language. It's like, yeah, in a lot of places, you know, there's 8 languages spoken in the country. So in this small area of 70 to 85 languages, in this small area, there's 70 to 85 languages spoken. So what does this suggest? It suggests that if you look at this map, how does a totally new language develop? Well, you have to be separate from other groups for a long time. It's the same way that new species develop, right? So when you look at this map of the Solomon Islands, you can imagine that over long periods of time, groups were mostly isolated. Now, the languages up in the northern part, like they have some understanding of one another's languages just automatically. Some of them are dialects, right? But there's some islands like this, like Makira Island down here, where it's like a completely different language than these islands up here, and they can't understand each other. So that means isolation for long periods of time, which makes sense because that's what we've seen with species there too, right? That's why there's such high species diversity. So very high cultural diversity, very high species diversity. Now, there we go. So basically what the workshop is about today is you are going to look at, you're going to learn a little bit reading a couple pages in the workshop about the biological diversity in the Solomon Islands, and then a little bit about the cultural diversity. And then you're going to look at basically how they historically have supported one another. So what things are important to cultural and biological diversity, and then how potentially cultural diversity could help deal with threats to biological diversity. So I'll just give you an intro to one of the main cultural diversity points that's important in terms of conserving biological diversity. So like many places around the world where indigenous peoples have lived on the land for a long time, there's a really strong ownership system. So one key word you'll have to know for today is land tenure. We've talked about this word before in other classes, but tenure doesn't just mean like when your professor gets tenure, it means who owns the land, who owns it. So in the Solomon Islands, land was managed through customary rights, much like a lot of groups in indigenous peoples in the United States used it, that we might be more familiar with that. So there's no single ownership of land, but there's more like your there's patches of land, like say a patch of forest up here where these people are logging, where it's like a certain family group or a set of family groups has the rights to log out certain trees in that area, right? Maybe another family group has rights to hunt in that area because they always have, or they exchanged it in exchange for some other good from another group. And then there's customary rights for fishing areas, right? And there's customary rights for where you can farm. So essentially what this means is that they have a couple things working for them that mean that they will manage their resources well. So there's accountability, right? If you go in and log out the forest, then you're not like in a multinational company and you fly back to the US the next day. Like you have to live there the next day and everyone hates you and is mad at you. So there's also usually punishments built into these customary structures. Like if you violate the rules, if you fish in somebody else's customary fishing grounds, there's a punishment, right? There's a fine. So these structures have managed to very sustainably manage the land and the fisheries for many thousands of years. But like many other parts of the globe, now with globalization and Western culture coming in, people are exposed to different cultures, and now they want a TV and like for the kids to go have a different type of education than they would normally have. And so some of those things require outside more, it's not subsistence living anymore, right? You can't just live off the land, you need cash money. So some people are trying to enter into the cash economy. And the main way they're doing that is through selling logging rights. But you can't sell what you don't own, right? So there's a lot of conflict in the Solomon Islands right now, and you'll see that if you do watch the video, because people are selling logging, individuals in the community, some like rogue individuals are going out and selling logging rights, but the community's like, well, you don't even own that. You don't even own that land. Because in tradition in the Solomon Islands, you have a right to cut down the tree in that land, but you don't own the land. So you can't sell the land. That's not something that you own. And so this is a real collision between the cultural systems in the Solomon Islands and the resource extraction Western systems that are coming in. So in the workshop, I'm not going to ask you, like I have in many workshops, to like make a plan for what to do or anything like that. I'm basically just asking you to just reflect on what are some of the ties between cultural and biological diversity in this case study, and what are some of the ways that cultural diversity could be leveraged to support protection of biodiversity. And like, what are the consequences to cultural diversity if biodiversity isn't supported, right? So the reading, the workshop itself is like about 6 pages of reading with a bunch of pictures in it. And then there's 4 questions that are like reflection questions. So I wasn't going to make the last workshop of the year have any write-up, but since we're in this new online world, I have to have some kind of write-up just to see that, you know, you all are here right now, but for everybody else. So I have some way of measuring participation in this workshop. So I guess right now I'll just open it to any questions about this. This is just, there's more information about everything I've touched on in that write-up that will help give you more details to answer those 4 questions. But they're kind of broad reflection questions. And the takeaway that I want you to get from this whole thing, and what we'll talk about more in my short lecture on Friday, is that you can't, so the theme of the week is people and conservation, right? And the idea is that you can't really see people as a totally separate thing from biological diversity. And when you start to do that and create this dichotomy, then you're oftentimes separating people who have really learned how to manage those resources. And so you're losing biodiversity protection in your efforts to protect it. So participation, or like respect for traditional ecological knowledge, is really important in biodiversity conservation. Okay, so do you guys have any questions about the workshop? About the Solomon Islands? Let's see, hold on one sec. It's all good? Okay. I hope you do all get a chance to travel to this place someday. It sounds really amazing. I did get to travel to the Cook Islands, which are somewhat close to there, and they really are fascinating. Like biologically, they're just fascinating in terms of biological diversity that you can just see while walking around. So I hope you all get the chance to do that sometime. But for now, you just get to learn about it through the workshop. Okay, so thank you all. I'm going to stop recording, and let me know if you have any questions with the workshop or anything. And otherwise, I will see you on the videos on Friday. Sound good? Okay. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.